This is a demonstration using the same format, the same root 5 divisions, and the same composition that we ended on last week. Instead of hatching in this one, I'm washing, and what I want us to focus on this week is using whatever method for making value that you have facility in to develop this composition using areas of value and not drawing out the shapes with line and then filling in. So this is a pretty long video. It's about 22 minutes long, and I've sped it up, but it's still pretty long. So I just want you to watch as I develop a more completed drawing. What we did last week was more studies, and so this time I'm going to bring this up a little bit more than I have in the past, so that takes me a little longer. And I just want you to see what it takes to do that. It takes time and it takes patience. For me, it takes understanding the process and trusting the process that I'm using. So you may not want to be able to watch this all in one go, but maybe you can stop it and watch a few minutes and then develop it as you go along. You could even try drawing along with me, and you can pause the video and see at what level the drawing is at a certain point. All in all, this drawing took me about an hour and a half to do. I used graphite on the whole thing. I'm not going to narrate it as much as I've narrated other ones. Just want you to watch the drawing develop. So I think you can see that I'm building up the values very gradually. Right now everything's still in high key. The lightest area is separated out on the left. The darker areas are still, they're starting to get a little darker than the other areas, but they're still in the high key. So one thing I want you to think about is letting the process happen gradually. Have patience. So I think I'm using a 3B here. Now 3B is a pretty soft pencil, and that means you can get fairly dark marks with it. I'm keeping it relatively sharp, and I'm using very little pressure, and I'm building up my values. Another thing that's different about this drawing is it's larger. I think it's about 9 inches square. So that gives me more room to move my hand around and not be worried if a stray mark gets into my light area. So if you give yourself a larger format and you give yourself enough time, you can develop your drawing. And honestly, this took me about 2 hours to draw, but I didn't draw it in one 2-hour sitting. I worked on it for 20 minutes here, 15 minutes there. Just let it develop, and when I got tired of it, I took a break. So I was working in the lightest area, but I noticed that there were some very subtle gradations in the lightest area, so I made a few marks that just very subtly changed the values in that light area. There's no rush on any of it. I'm giving myself as much time as I need to do what I want to do. Like I said in the last video, I start with a really broad form and I work my way from the outside into the form, from the outer edges towards the form. That way the form is bigger than it's going to be, and I gradually work towards the edge of the form. So you'll notice that the light area is going to get more and more precise, and it's also going to get more and more constricted or smaller. So now I'm working on just adjusting the values and setting up my value structure. So I'm looking at what are the darkest areas, what are the lightest areas, and what are the areas that are of middle value. And at the same time, kind of smoothing out my marks. Marks don't look as rough in this drawing because they're smaller in relation to the size of the format. So that, larger format might be helpful to those of you who are having a hard time with hatching. It's easier to smooth things out. So I'm doing a little bit of refining of shapes, finding some of the subtle gradations in the light areas, trying to get the exact shapes that I want, but not perfectly exact, just make them closer to what I want them to be, still giving it time to develop. Also, if I find myself working in one area too much, paying too much attention to one small area, I make myself go to other parts of the drawing so that I'm trying to bring the whole thing up at the same time. Now I'm pushing the darks a little bit. I'm still working with the 3B, trying to get a range of values that I can get with that tool. I remember when I first learned that there were different pencils of different grades, like a 2B or 3B or whatever. It was so exciting to me, and I would see how much I could make a 2B do before I would change to a 3B, and then how far I can make it go till I change to a 4B, just to see what my instruments would do. And I would save the very darkest for my softest pencil, which at that time was an ebony. I don't know if any of you have ebonies. Working on that dark on the right side that runs along the right edge, getting a little subtle variation in the light areas, trying to differentiate values within the high key areas or the light areas, and also trying to bring out the middle value right there on the right. Bringing out that dark that runs along that vertical, that's centered on that vertical. And once I make it darker, then it makes me have to go around and make the other areas around it a little darker too, so there's not too much contrast right there. Another thing you want to be looking for is what areas are the areas of highest contrast, and try to keep those as your areas of highest contrast in your drawing. So if you watch this whole thing, you'll notice that I spend a lot of time gradually building up layers of tone. And refining my shapes and smoothing out my marks. You see that the darkest areas are starting to become clearly the darkest areas, and the lightest areas becoming clearly the lightest area. And getting more specific about the shapes in those areas. And as I do this, my grid lines, which are also drawn in graphite, slowly become absorbed into the drawing. Again, being very careful about variations in the light area. I don't want them to be too dark. So at this point, I was wanting some deeper tones, so I switched to a 4B woodless graphite pencil. So these are really cool. Some of you may have this. It's just a stick of graphite, has a plastic coating, and you can sharpen it like any other pencil. Because this is a slightly softer pencil than the one I was using before, I can press with it a little harder and get darker marks. So you can see that I'm bringing my darks out more here. But if I use very little pressure, I can still make light marks. And I think you can tell by looking at that top edge that the benefit of taping off your drawing is you can go beyond the edges of your format and not worry about it too much. Bringing out that dark that runs down that vertical. If I want to make that light appear lighter, I need to darken the middle gray a little bit, which is what I'm working on right there. So I really want to refine my lights by having them contrast with the darks in the middle. So I'm starting to work around the lights a little bit more, getting those middle grays a little darker. Just washing over all of that. Like I said, you could hatch this, or you could wash this, or you could use charcoal even if you wanted to. It's just about gradually building up your values. At this point, I'm starting to refine my shapes a little more, going into the darks and getting them darker. Trying to blend some of those variations of dark and those variations of middle value. I'm just continuing to refine the values and the shapes and subtle variations within certain areas, like if it's a light area, creating some variations of light. If it's a dark area, creating some variations of dark. Also, really making those shapes be what I want them to be. And being patient is really important, and also being highly observant and sensitive to subtle variations. At this point, the drawing was looking a little too textured for me, so I got my Faber-Castell eraser pencil and did a little bit of blending, and I'll work back and forth between the 4B woodless graphite pencil and the eraser pencil. There's the eraser pencil, just sort of smoothing out some marks, not erasing mistakes, just smoothing out marks. Smudging a little bit with it, bringing a little value into area. Just if you want a little subtle value, you can take that eraser and push some of that graphite or charcoal where you want it to go. So in those lighter areas, I'm working more with that Faber-Castell. I hope if you're watching all the way through this, you'll notice that I haven't drawn a line around anything and then filled it in. Just letting the shapes evolve, letting them occur. Just gradually deepening my values where they need to be deeper, blending where it needs to be blended. Refining. So here's the final drawing. It's still a study. It's more resolved than the other studies that I've done, that I've demonstrated of this particular composition. What we're going to be working with this week is gradually becoming very familiar with this composition and building it up in several different exercises. So I hope that this was helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to do.